The Sony A9, is it hip or is it hype? Welcome back to the vlog. So you guys asked me for my opinion on the Sony A9, what I thought about it. And you know, I'm a straight shooter. I'm going to tell you how I see it. And some people will like it and some people won't. And I understand that. Take everything that I say with a big helping of salt, okay? Not a grain of salt, a big handful. So I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of videos on YouTube, and a lot of them are just, oh my God, this thing is just unbelievable, okay? And they go right down the specs of, the 20 frames per second and the new sensor and all of this stuff. And all this being true. And I'm gonna talk about it, but I wanna kind of pull everyone off the ledge a little bit and kind of give you a little bit of my thoughts on it and who they're shooting for, and do I think that they're going to get them. Now, of course, that's the sports photographers, but I'll kind of get into that. Now, as I always do, I like to compare the specs on the camera that I'm talking about with another camera. Now, a lot of you guys are going to be like, yeah, he's going to compare the A9 to, for example, a Nikon D5 or maybe the Canon 1DX Mark II, right? Because that's who Sony is shooting for, right? Those are the cameras. They're looking to get into that space, that pro space. And that is the camera that professionals that are sports photographers are using. Those are the cameras. But I'm not going to do that today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the specs to what I think the camera is more akin to. And that is its little sister or little brother, let's call it, the Sony Alpha 6500. Now you're like, well, that's a crop sensor. That's not a full frame. How is he going to compare it? Well, just bear with me. Let's look at the specs as I do. I'm going to grab my iPad and we're going to go down the specs real quick. I'm going to try to make it as quick and painless as possible. Then we're going to talk about it a little bit. So let's go through it and you'll see where I'm going with this. Now, maximum resolution on both cameras is 6,000 by 4,000. They're both 24 megapixel cameras. The sensors in them, of course, the 6500 is an APS-C, whereas the A9 is a full frame. They both are CMOS sensors. The difference is, of course, the A9 has that brand new sensor, whereas the A7 as well as 6500 are backlit sensors, and the A9 has their new front lit stack sensor that does full pixel readouts. So it is quicker, and this is for Sony to address the, let's call it jello effect or rolling shutter. So we'll get into that later. Now the next thing is 4K. That of course is the hot topic right now. All the cameras are getting 4K put into them. Now Sony said, oh, we have full frame sensor and we're going to be covering the full frame with our 4K video recording. Well, that's the case and it's not the case. Now, the 6500 will do 4K. It does it at 24 frames as well as 25 frames and 30 frames. Now, the A9 also does 24 frames, 25 frames, as well as 30 frames. The difference is the A9 that's supposed to be doing this full coverage, yes, it does at 24 and 25 frames, but as soon as you hit 30 frames per second, it is now cropping into the 4K. So you're not getting true 4K coverage from this camera if that's what you're looking for at 30 frames per second. Next is 1080p. Both will do slow-mo at 120 frames per second. Now ISO, the crop sensor of the 6500 will go up to 25,000, whereas the new full frame A9 will take you up to 51,000 ISO. Next, image stabilization. Both have IBIS, which is your in-body image stabilization, 5-axis, which is fantastic. Now, what kind of changes here is in the autofocus. Now, both cameras, the A6500 as well as the A9, have contrast detection autofocus as well as phase detection. Now, one of the big claims to fame is the number of points that the A9 has. Now, it has 693 points of autofocus phase detection. Now, the A6500 isn't a slouch at 425 points of phase detection. What changes here is in contrast detection. The A6500 has 169 points of contrast detection, whereas the A9 only has 25 points. Next is the viewfinder, the EVF. The A6500 has 2.4 megapixels, whereas the new A9 has 3.6 megapixels. Much better, very, very high quality megapixels. And as far as I understand, that EVF is absolutely stunning in this A9. Next is maximum shutter speed. You have a maximum of 1/4000th of a second in the 6500, where it goes up to 1/8000th of a second for the A9, which is great. Next is one of the major topics here, is in continuous focus. Now this is one of the hype things that you hear across all other videos, and wow, this camera will do 20 frames per second continuous. That is absolutely the case, and it will actually capture over 240 frames of RAW before having to cache. That's amazing, guys. That is really great. Now the A6500 isn't a slouch either at 11 frames per second. Now what's really interesting here, guys, is the Fujifilm's X-T2 has been capturing at 14 plus frames per second for a long time. So an extra 6 frames, okay, it's a lot, but it's not like just earth-shattering either. There's other cameras that have been doing this for quite some time. But now if you compare it to, for example, a Canon 1DX Mark II, I mean, that thing is at about 17 frames per second, and it's doing it without any shake. It's doing it really, really well. And that has a shutter and a mirror and everything flipping around in there, right? So, I mean, that 20 frames per second is a big thing, but it's not really that big of a deal. Now, when we move from an electronic shutter to a mechanical shutter, the A9 captures an abysmal, I mean, a horrible 5 frames per second. Guys, that's literally what my Canon 5D did way back, like the Mark I, like 8-9 years ago or something, okay? 5 frames per second is really slow. That is not good. Where its little sister or little brother, let's call it, 6500, will actually capture 8 frames per second. And if you got a battery grip for the 6500, it'll go up to 11 frames per second. Mechanical. That is really interesting. Keep that in mind as we go down this list. So now the next thing is storage. Now this is always an issue for pros. They want 2 cards, right? They don't want 1. They need backup. They want to shoot 2 SDs or 2 CFs. They want 2. Now, of course, Sony addressed this problem. They now have 2 SDs, whereas the 6500 still has only 1 SD in it. What they also did was take one of those SDs and make it into a UHS-2 for faster write speed, which is awesome. Next, you have the camera's wireless connectivity. Both have 802.11 as well as NFC, but the A9 now introduced Bluetooth to the mix. Now, the next thing is battery life, and battery life has always been an issue for the Sony cameras, and we know that they had to address it, especially if they were marketing towards the professional. And they did, guys. They came out with a new battery that has a duration or length of twice the old battery. So for example, the 6500 will get you 350 shots for a single battery, whereas the A9 and its new battery will get you up to 650 shots. Now, you can also get a battery grip for that A9, which will add 2 additional batteries into the mix, which will get you probably over 1,500, close to 2,000 shots with that camera. As professionals, that's the numbers that we need to be at. We need to be able to capture over 1,000, maybe 1,500 frames without having to go through batteries like chiclets, and that was always the issue with Sony cameras. Now finally we go into MSRP. The 6500 will set you back $1,400, whereas the A9 will set you back a whopping $4,500. Now, let me put down my iPad for a second here and get into my thoughts on it. Now, Sony is marketing towards a sports shooter for the A9, and I get it. You know, it makes sense. 20 frames per second is very, very quick. The problem here is this current sports shooters are using, like, for example, the Nikon D5, as well as Canon side is the 1DX Mark II, and they're capturing close to 20 frames per second as it is. The Canon is at 17 frames per second with little to no shake. So you're capturing crisp images, even though that shutter is banging around in there. My thoughts on it is simply this. Most sports shooters out there that have invested $40,000, $50,000 in glass are going to be hard pressed to sell all that glass to go into the Sony line of cameras. Some have already, but I think a lot of the sports shooters have not. The reason being, and the big story that isn't being covered here, I don't think very well, is the lenses. The body, I would say, is 33% of the puzzle, where 66% of the puzzle is the lenses. And sports shooters are shooting with lenses that are $5,000, $10,000, $30,000 a lens. Massive prime lenses, okay? Sony just don't have them. They just don't. They came out with their professional line of G Master lenses not that long ago, let's say a year or under, and they're really beautiful. Now you pay full dollar just like you would get a Canon, piece of glass, an L glass for them, but rightfully so. They're really good lenses. They're prime, and they do a great job. The problem here is there's not enough of them. Canon has a myriad of lenses that the sports photographers can use. And same thing with Nikon. If you go to any event, you just see a sea of white lenses. And I'm telling you, they're not Sony's, right? Those are Canon lenses because the majority of sports shooters are Canon currently. So what do? Do you strap on, for example, an adapter and use like Canon glass on your Sony? That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So I think one of the major problems that we're having here with this, saying that this Sony A9 is for, sports shooters and they're going to migrate to it, is the glass. It's just not there. It's not there yet. Also, we are dealing with a rolling shutter. So I see eventually we're going to go past the rolling shutter and go into, for example, a global shutter. Now, what's the difference? Rolling shutter is where it's capturing line by line, and this is how it's reading the sensor. A global shutter reads frame by frame by frame, the entire sensor in one shot. That's how a global shutter works. Now, the problem with that is, and you guys are like, well, why don't they all use it? Well, the problem with that is it takes a lot more real estate inside the camera to be able to do that, to turn all those pixels on and off, and to read them that quickly all at once instead of line by line by line. The problem is a global shutter will dramatically affect dynamic range. So your ISO will be hit and hit hard. The other issue is with sync. The A9, you can only get to 5 frames per second with a mechanical shutter. Well, you need your mechanical shutter if you want to shoot flash, right, guys? Well, how about if you're a wedding guy? Well, you need flash, right? You're in the worst situation ever. Same thing with event people. If you're an event guy, you're going from outside where, you have bright daylight to going inside where you have just abysmal light, whereas it's, tungsten here and fluorescent there, and you have different colors going on, and you have darkness here and light here. It's just a mess, right? So you really need to be able to shoot flash and do it well. So you can also look at it, for example, as an event photographer that's shooting, let's say, an arena, and they're, let's say, a hockey guy. Or maybe they're shooting in an arena and they are doing volleyball, let's say. A lot of these sports shooters are setting up strobes throughout the arena, or they're using arena strobes, okay? So one way or another, you have to sync, right? And you're not going to be able to do it with your electronic shutter. These guys are shooting, high speed at 17 frames per second, but they're actually banging off, strobes at that speed. They're like, and you can see them where everything is pulsating throughout the arena as they're capturing a ton of images. So, for me, the way I look at this is, Sony is such an innovative company, and this camera is definitely innovative. The sensor is innovative. It's really, really great. I think that they're holding back. That's my personal opinion. I think that you're going to see like an A7 come out soon that has better video capabilities than this, much better. That's number one. And I think there's going to be some other things that they put into this A7 that's going to get it right on that crossover where you go between, let's call it pro-am, pro amateur to an actual pro on that A7 side. I think that they're putting their mind right, let's call it, by addressing a lot of issues that pro photographers are having, but I don't think that they have gotten all of it. One other thing that I want to talk to you guys about, and that is support. Now, Sony, as far as I understand, do not fix their own cameras. They outsource it, whereas Canon and Nikon do. The issue that I'm having with this is how secure is the pro to move to Sony, right, and have to capture that shot? okay? And know that they have, let's say, 5 bodies and all 5 need to be working. 2 go down, and they need to send in those bodies, 2 bodies to have replaced next day overnight. Now, Canon, that's not gonna be a problem. Now, Nikon either. Also, Canon and Nikon, all big events, you're going to see a Canon or Nikon booth or internal behind the scenes location where you can go and have your cameras fixed. For example, if I'm covering WPPI in Las Vegas, or we're out in New York at the Javits Center for the PhotoPlus Expo, there is a Canon area in there by the press room, okay, that you can go as press and go have your gear fixed right there on the spot. Sony needs to do that also. So the pros are going to need to see this. They're going to need to see that Sony has a presence at all big events, that has overnight repairs, that has really great customer service and response time. If they don't, they're not going to feel secure enough to move into Sony. So a lot of things have to come together. You have to have a great body, you have to have a ton of lenses, and you have to have service that's second to none, that people will just feel secure in using your system. And I don't think that Sony has all those pieces to the puzzle put together as of yet, but they're working at it, and they're working hard at it, and I commend them for it. So that's it, guys. That's my personal take on the Sony A9. Is it there yet? I don't think so. Is there going to be a mass exodus from Nikon and Canon over to Sony because of this camera? No, but the innovation is there. They're doing it, and I give them 2 thumbs up for it. I think it's fantastic. So as always, if you enjoy my content, give me a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. And subscribe to the channel so you can get all of my rants and how-tos and tips and tricks I do on this vlog as they become available. Finally, head over to my website, JCristina.com, where you can find a lot of photography tools I've invented for photographers just like you. That's it, guys. I'm out of here for yet another vlog. Don't forget to put your comments below. I want to hear your thoughts on the Sony A9. We'll see you in the next vlog. Take care.